the woman no one noticed, and the mountain man who went completely still. What would you do if the quiet woman everyone dismissed as just another immigrant, the one who kept her eyes down and her answers short, suddenly whispered 3 words that made the most dangerous man in Montana go completely still? Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And stay close, because the secret buried inside this story will change everything you think you know about who was really in danger. The snow at the foot of the 3 crosses never melted at the same time as the rest of the hillside. Elias Boone had noticed this for 9 years and had never once tried to explain it. He stood in the blue half-light before sunrise, the way he stood every morning, hands loose at his sides, breath rising in small white clouds. He did not bow his head. He did not speak. He counted 30 seconds. He had learned long ago that 30 seconds was the precise amount of time a man could stand in front of something he could not fix before the stillness began to feel like surrender. And then he turned and walked back down toward the cabin. The crosses were made from pine. He had cut them himself on a morning he remembered in pieces rather than whole. The wood had faded over the years to the color of ash, and the names he had carved into each one were worn shallow, now smoothed by seasons of frost and thaw. Anyone passing by and reading them would only be able to make out the first letters. He preferred it that way. The Bitterroot Mountains did not keep sentiment. That was the first thing they taught you, and they taught it without mercy. Through storms that arrived without warning, through cold that pressed the air flat against the earth, through the way silence could stretch so wide and so deep that a man could lose himself in it entirely if he was not careful. Elias had learned to use that silence the way other men used walls. It kept things out, it kept things in. After 9 years, it had become as natural as breathing, and he did not question it any more than he questioned the need to breathe. He built the fire. He heated water. He ate standing up near the window, watching the grey light strengthen over the valley below. Dry Creek was visible on clear mornings, a dark scatter of buildings at the edge of the flatland where the mountains gave way to open ground. He could see the smoke rising from the blacksmith's forge and the faint geometry of the church steeple. He did not look at it long. By the time the sun cleared the eastern peaks, Elias was already moving along the trapline. He ran through the timber above the cabin, checking snares, resetting where needed reading, the signs the forest left in snow and mud and broken branch. He had learned to read this land the way other men read books, not because someone taught him, but because he had needed to, and necessity had always been a faster teacher than patience. He did not think about the 3 crosses while he worked. He had trained himself not to. The town of Dry Creek appeared in the flat below the mountains like something that had simply forgotten to leave. It had arrived in the territory during the rush of settlement 15 years earlier, when men with ambitions larger than their means had spread across the valley, convinced they were building the foundations of something permanent. Some of them had been right. Most had not. What remained was a practical place, a mercantile, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, a church, a small hotel with 5 rooms, and a leaking roof, and the kind of stubborn daily life that frontier settlements maintained through sheer refusal to collapse. Elias rode into Dry Creek 4 or 5 times a year, always on the same errand: salt cartridges, iron nails, and whatever else the mountains could not provide and necessity demanded. He tied his horse outside Samuel Carter's mercantile, said as few words as the transaction required, and left before the evening lamps were lit. Men at the saloon had theories about him, that he had been a soldier, that he had been a scout, that he had been born somewhere wilder and further north, and had simply never found his way back. Elias had heard versions of all these theories. On the rare occasions he arrived early enough to catch the tail end of other people's conversations. He did not correct any of them. He preferred the version of himself that existed only in other people's speculation. That version had no history anyone could verify, no wound anyone could locate. It was on one of these supply runs in the first week of October that the stage from the east arrived. Elias was inside the mercantile when it pulled up outside, the horses steaming and the wheels thick with road mud. He was standing at the back counter while Samuel Carter searched for a specific size of iron hinge, and so he had a clear view through the front window when the passengers began to step down. He watched without particular interest a traveling salesman with two trunks, an older couple who appeared to be related to someone in town because a woman came running from the direction of the boarding house to meet them, and then a woman came down the coach steps alone, and he stopped watching and went back to examining the wall of shelves behind the counter. But something made him look again. She was carrying a single worn leather suitcase. Her clothes were plain and practical, a grey wool cloak, dark dress, low boots that had been resoled at least twice. Nothing about her clothing suggested anything other than a woman traveling on limited means across difficult terrain. She stood at the edge of the step for a moment with her hand still on the door of the coach, not stepping down, yet not stepping back up, just pausing. And in that pause before she arranged her expression back into something neutral and controlled, Elias caught something in her face that he recognized from a very specific and private place. The look of someone calculating how much of themselves to show to a place they had not yet decided was safe. He looked away. Samuel found the hinge. Elias collected his supplies and went outside to load his horse. The woman was already crossing the street toward the mercantile. He stepped aside to let her pass on the wooden walkway. She moved with a kind of careful economy, not hurried, not slow, each step deliberate. She glanced up as she passed him, and their eyes met for approximately 1 second. Nothing happened. Two strangers passed each other on a street in a frontier town. Elias mounted his horse and rode north toward the mountains. He told himself the whole way back that whatever he had seen in her face was none of his concern. He told himself this with the particular firmness of a man who knows he is not entirely convinced. Eleanor Marsh. That was the name she gave Samuel Carter when she came through his door. She said it in the way people say names they have grown accustomed to, not with the slight hesitation of someone reaching for something unfamiliar, but not with the ease of something bone deep either. Somewhere in between. Samuel, who had spent 30 years behind a counter, watching people notice the distinction and then forgot it immediately because the mercantile was busy, and he was short-handed, and she was asking about work. She said she was a widow. From Philadelphia. Her husband had died the previous winter. She had come west because there was nothing left for her in the east, and she had heard there was work to be found in the territories if a person was willing to do it. Samuel looked at her for a moment. She looked back steadily without defiance and without appeal. Just steadiness, the kind that came from practice. He asked if she could mend clothes. She said yes. He asked if she could keep simple ledgers. She said yes. He offered a small wage and the room behind the store. She accepted without negotiating, which, Samuel noted privately, a woman alone in unfamiliar territory who accepted the first terms offered was either desperate or educated, and the two were not mutually exclusive. He decided not to think too hard about which she was and showed her the room. The room was small, a cot, a window, a hook on the wall, a basin. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a moment, and then she said simply, "Good," as if the smallness of it was exactly what she had been hoping for. Within a week, she had reorganized the shelving system in the back of the store, repaired a backlog of torn work coats that had been piling up since September, and written 3 weeks of overdue ledger entries in a handwriting so precise and regular that Samuel found himself staring at it for a full minute before he could quite explain why it unsettled him. The women of Dry Creek, who gathered most afternoons on the steps of the church or near the well on the east side of the street, began to accumulate observations. She held a teacup wrong, or rather, she held it correctly handle pinched between 2 fingers rather than enclosed in a working hand, which was wrong for this place, and they all knew it. She pronounced certain words with a slight elongation that was not quite a Philadelphia accent. It was not quite anything that any of them could place, which was more troubling than if it had been clearly foreign. She stood too straight for a woman who spent her days bending over a sewing table. She never volunteered anything about herself, but she never seemed uncomfortable with silence the way people who are hiding things usually are. She seemed comfortable with it, the way people who are used to it are like. Silence was not the absence of conversation, but a thing in itself, a medium she moved through without friction. The speculation grew. Governess was the most common theory. Someone from a wealthy household in the East, fallen on hard times. The stitching she used on the mending work supported this. It was too delicate and too consistent for purely practical training. It was the work of someone who had learned fine needlework before they had learned plain mending. Aldous Kane, who had arrived in Dry Creek 3 weeks before Eleanor, had a different kind of interest. He was the new minister, having come from somewhere in the east. He described vaguely as the Ohio Valley, with letters of introduction that appeared legitimate and a speaking manner that was genuinely impressive. He gave his first Sunday sermon on the theme of new beginnings in new lands, and the congregation received him with a warmth that surprised even him. Kane was a careful man. He moved through the town at the pace of someone who was mapping it, not conspicuously, not with the deliberate attention of a man on a specific errand, but with the accumulated attentiveness of someone building a detailed picture of a place, one small observation at a time. On the third day after Eleanor's arrival, he came into the mercantile for a modest purchase, a spool of thread, a tin of coffee, and struck up a conversation with her at the counter while Samuel was in the back. The conversation was friendly. He asked how she was settling in. He asked about Philadelphia, which neighborhood, what her husband had done for work, whether she had family still there. Eleanor answered each question the way she answered all questions, politely, briefly, and without ever providing the kind of specific detail that would allow a follow-up. Kane watched her face while she spoke with the particular attention of a man who is not actually listening to the answers, but is watching what the questions produce. When he left, he walked directly to the small house on the east side of the street where he was boarding, sat at the writing desk in his room, and wrote a short letter. The letter went out on the next post east. Eleanor, sorting newly arrived stock at the front counter, watched him cross the street from the window. She did not know what he had written, but she had been watched by careful men before, and she recognized the quality of that watching. It had a weight to it, a direction. She turned back to the shelves and began counting bolts of cloth. She counted slowly because she needed something to do with her hands while her mind worked. That evening, after the store closed, she went to the room behind the store and sat on the floor beside the cot. She opened her leather suitcase, not the top, but lifted the whole base lining and touched something flat and hard beneath it. A folded document stitched to the interior with small close stitches in thread, the same color as the lining. She pressed her fingers against it, let out one slow breath. Still there. She closed the suitcase, sat on the cot, looked at the small window across from her at the dark square of night beyond it. One more time, she told herself. It was not a prayer, and it was not a wish. It was an instruction. The kind you give yourself when you have already used up hope and are running on something harder and less comfortable. One more time. The storm that arrived in the third week of October was not the season's first, but it was the first that intended to stay. The older ranchers had been watching the western peaks since morning. The clouds had been building, not the high formless clouds that sometimes came to nothing but the low dark ones that pressed down close to the mountain slopes and turned the afternoon light the specific gray color of cold iron. By midday, the wind had sharpened. By early afternoon, it was moving debris through the streets with a purposefulness that made people glance up and hurry indoors. Samuel Carter was in the middle of a supply accounting when he remembered the Miller parcel. A package for the Miller Ranch promised for this week sitting on the shelf behind the counter. The Miller place was only a few miles out, an easy ride on a clear day. He looked at the window. The snow was just beginning to fall light and scattered. He called Eleanor from the back. She assessed the sky from the doorway for a moment. The snow was not heavy. The road was clear. She said yes. This was the nature of the mistake. Not recklessness, but ordinary miscalculation. The kind the Bitterroot Mountains had been producing for as long as people had been living beneath them. The storm was faster than it looked. By the time Eleanor had ridden 2 miles north of Dry Creek on the trail that wound along the lower mountain slope, the scattered flakes had thickened to a curtain and the curtain had thickened to a wall. She could not see the road ahead. She could barely see the horse's ears. She did what she had learned to do in these situations, what the years of practicing how to survive had taught her. She slowed the horse, leaned forward, kept her weight balanced, and her hands light on the reins. The horse moved carefully, feeling for ground beneath the snow. The gust came from the left side. It was not a strong gust by Montana standards, but on a narrow mountain trail with the right wheel already riding close to the soft shoulder where the trail fell away into the slope, it was enough. The horse startled. The cart lurched left. The wheel dropped off the trail edge and the whole thing went sideways in a single violent motion, and Eleanor had just enough time to understand what was happening before the ground met her left shoulder and she was rolling the white sky and white ground, exchanging places several times until she stopped. Silence. She lay on her back in a depression in the snow. Above her, the sky was a flat, featureless white. The cold was already working on her, pressing in through her cloak, through her dress, through the layers of wool and determination she had packed herself into that morning. She tried to stand. Her left leg was not injured, but it was numb from the cold and the impact both. And what her intention translated into was a slow turn onto her side, a hand pushing against the snow, and approximately 6 inches of upward progress before she stopped. She lay still and thought. This was the other thing the years had taught her when the situation was beyond what movement could fix. You stopped moving. You conserved warmth. You reduced your surface area. You waited. She pulled the cloak tighter, curled her knees toward her chest, tucked her face into the wool at her collar. The snow continued to fall, covering her incrementally, and she let it. It would provide insulation. She had read it somewhere years ago in a library that no longer existed, in a house that no longer existed, in a life that no longer existed. The information had stayed with her long after everything else from that life was gone. She waited. Elias's horse stopped on the high trail above the accident site. He had been riding the eastern ridge path, heading back toward the cabin from a trap check that had run later than he intended. The storm had found him too, but he knew these trails blind and in worse conditions and was not concerned. He gave the horse its head and let it find the safest line through the deepening snow. When it stopped, he did not urge it forward. 9 years in the bitter route had taught him that horses stopped for reasons a man's senses could not always access immediately. He sat still, letting his own senses settle, and listened. Wind, snow, the far sound of a branch under too much weight. And below that, almost part of the silence, rather than a break in it, something else. A sound so small and irregular that he might have been inventing it from the noise of the storm. He dismounted, tied the horse to the nearest tree, moved forward and down the slope on foot, angling toward the sound. The overturned cart appeared out of the white like a dark thought. The horse was still standing, trembling hard, one foreleg tangled in the traces. And in the snow a few feet away, a shape that was the wrong shape for snow. He moved faster. He knelt and brushed snow from the face. And even beneath the cold white pallor of her skin and the ice crystals in her lashes, he recognized her. The woman from the street in front of Carter's store. A week ago. The one with the calculating pause on the coach step. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was there, shallow, too shallow, but it was there. He did not weigh the situation. There was nothing to weigh. He lifted her, wrapped his coat around her, carried her to where the horse waited. The ride back to the cabin was the longest he could remember since he had moved to the mountain. He held her in front of him on the saddle, one arm across her, to keep her upright, his jaw set against the wind. She drifted in and out of awareness. Once she said something that was almost words. Once her hand moved toward his arm and then fell back. He talked to her the whole way, not warmly, just steadily. "Stay awake, not much further. Stay awake." It was the same voice he used with horses in bad weather. The one that does not promise anything, only continues. The cabin appeared through the storm. He got her inside. He built the fire up to a height he had not maintained since the worst storm of the year before. He got her out of the wet cloak and boots and wrapped her in the 2 heaviest blankets he owned and set her close to the stove where the heat would reach her quickly. He boiled water, found the broth he kept in a clay pot on the back shelf, spooned small amounts into her mouth whenever she surfaced close enough to consciousness to swallow. He did not look at the 3 crosses through the window. He was too busy. That first night, Eleanor moved through fever the way people move through weather, pushed by it occasional islands of stillness, no real direction. She spoke during the fever, fragments and pieces, mostly in English, but a measured formal English that sounded nothing like a laborer's wife from Philadelphia. Occasionally in French, quick and low, as if she were continuing a conversation that had begun somewhere else. Elias understood some of the French. Not all. He had learned it during a brief period many years earlier that he did not think about anymore. What he understood was enough to know that whatever was following this woman had not been left behind on any road she had traveled. It had come with her. It was still with her now, even in fever, even in sleep. It lived in her the way old fear lives, not as a memory, but as a reflex wired into the body's deepest responses, so that even when the conscious mind was dark and unguarded, the body still knew to be afraid. Near midnight, she said 3 words clearly in the sharp, sudden voice of someone who has woken in a wrong place at a wrong time. "Please, not again." Then she turned on her side and her breathing steadied and she slipped back into sleep. Elias sat with those words for a long time in the quiet of the cabin, the fire burning low and the storm pressing against the walls outside. They were not the words of a widow from Philadelphia who had come west for a new beginning. They were the words of someone in the specific grip of a specific terror. Someone who knew the thing they feared by name and had hoped once more that the name would not find them. He had heard that quality of fear before. He had made that sound before, not with those words, but with the same meaning. He banked the fire and stayed awake until morning. The second night was quieter. Her fever broke near midnight. By morning, she was sleeping instead of restless, and the difference between the two was significant enough that he allowed himself 4 hours in the chair beside the stove. He woke to find her watching him from the blankets. She did not startle when he opened his eyes, which meant she had been awake long enough to have already decided how to be in this room. He noted this. "You're in my cabin," he said. "Storm came through. You were caught on the North Trail." She took this in. How long? This is the second morning. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her doing the calculation, what it meant to have been here alone with a man she did not know for 2 days. He could also see her deciding not to make it mean more than it needed to mean. "You saved my life," she said finally. Not gratefully exactly, more like stating a fact that had implications she intended to take seriously. "You would have frozen before dark," he confirmed. She looked around the cabin. The way her eyes moved told him she was genuinely seeing it rather than simply glancing. She noticed the specific placement of tools, the arrangement of shelves, the logbook on the table. Her eyes went to the window, past the glass, up the slope behind the cabin, to the 3 grey shapes standing against the snowfield. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked away. She did not ask. He did not explain. And in the specific silence that followed, something was established between them that was not quite trust and not quite understanding, but was something in the same family, a mutual recognition that some things could be seen without being required to be spoken. He made broth. She drank it without complaint. By afternoon, she was sitting up, and by evening, she was walking carefully to the window and back to prove to herself she could. He watched this from the table where he was mending a piece of harness and said nothing. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm had passed enough to ride. He prepared the small sled and his horse, and they rode down the mountain in the clean cold of the day after bad weather, when the world looked pressed and particular and every edge was sharp. They spoke very little on the way down. He told her which trail to take if she needed to come back this way. She listened and nodded. When they reached the edge of Dry Creek, he slowed the horse and looked at the town for a moment. The smoke, the movement, the familiar geometry of a place that had decided he was a curiosity it could manage. He said without turning to look at her, "Small town, don't tell people where you've been the last 2 days." She turned to look at him. "Why?" He did not answer immediately. He was thinking about what he had heard during her fever, what he had recognized and what he had not. He was thinking about the look on her face in front of Carter's store and the look on the minister's face when he had passed him on the street the previous week, and a dozen small things that a man who had lived alone for 9 years and trained himself to see instead of speak had accumulated without meaning to. "Because they'll make it mean something it doesn't," he said finally, "and whatever you came here to start over from, you won't get the chance." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You don't know anything about what I came here from." "No," he agreed. "I don't." He waited to see if she would say more. She didn't. He turned the horse toward the mountain road and rode back up without looking behind him. She stood at the edge of the town with the wind at her back, watching him go until the snow of the trail erased him. Then she turned and walked into Dry Creek and began the next chapter of the lie that was keeping her alive. The days that followed were ordinary in appearance and not ordinary in substance. The way the surface of water is ordinary and whatever moves below it is not. Eleanor worked. She mended. She wrote in the ledgers. She answered questions with small sufficient answers that kept people satisfied enough not to push further. She learned the rhythms of the town, who arrived when, who spoke to whom, what the geometry of the social order was, and where she stood in it. She stood at the bottom edge of acceptable, which was where she had placed herself intentionally, low enough not to attract the attention of anyone with real power, high enough not to become the subject of organized hostility. It was a calculated position. She had learned to calculate it through practice. Kane came into the store twice more. Both times, he was pleasant and unhurried and asked questions that seemed like small talk. Both times, Eleanor answered the same way she always did, politely, briefly, with nothing specific enough to verify. Both times after he left, she watched him walk back toward the church and tried to identify the specific quality of unease she felt. It was not fear exactly. Fear she knew too well to mistake it for this. This was more like the feeling of seeing a familiar configuration of elements and recognizing from experience what that configuration tended to produce. She had been in places before that seemed safe and were not. She knew the early signs, the careful friendliness, the specific interest masquerading as general interest, the questions that seemed random but weren't. On the 15th day after her arrival, the new shipment from Helena arrived at the mercantile, and among the items were several pieces of jewelry intended for wealthier households in the region, including a silver necklace, delicate, fine-worked, worth more than the rest of the jewelry in the case combined. Eleanor handled it briefly while sorting the new stock, turning it in the light, and set it on the display shelf behind the counter. That afternoon, the store was unusually crowded. More people than a Tuesday had any right to produce. Ranchers buying winter supplies, women examining new cloth bolts, two men in from the north she had not seen before who lingered near the front of the store without buying anything. The boy Jesse was moving between the storeroom and the front, bringing out stock. He was 12 and generally cheerful, and had been kind to Eleanor in the small ways children sometimes are. Today he moved with a stiffness that was not his usual way. He would not meet her eye. She noticed this. She filed it. She found a moment alone with him near the back shelf while he was retrieving a sack of flour. She did not accuse. She did not raise her voice. She simply placed one hand lightly on his shoulder and asked very quietly, "Who asked you to do it, Jesse?" The boy froze. His hands tightened on the flour sack. He did not answer, but his eyes moved just once quickly toward the window, toward the east side of the street, toward the small house where the minister boarded. Then he looked back at the floor and said nothing. Eleanor looked at the window for a long moment. She understood then the whole of it, the architecture of it, the patience of it. Someone had prepared this town before she arrived. Someone had placed a careful, friendly man in a position of trust and given him a task. And the task was nearly complete. If she said what she knew, that the boy had been paid, that the necklace was planted, that the minister was not what he appeared to be, she would have to explain how she knew. And that explanation led directly back to a man she had crossed an ocean to escape, back to the reason she was here, back to everything she had spent 11 months burying under the name Eleanor Marsh. She could not say any of it. She turned back to the front of the store and stood behind the counter and waited for what was coming. When Samuel Carter found the necklace in her bag, the room did not erupt. It contracted, the specific contraction of a space in which a judgment has been made and is only waiting to be stated aloud. People stepped back. One man muttered something. A woman near the door shook her head in a way that suggested she had been expecting this all along. Samuel's face held the expression of a man who had hoped to be wrong. "I cannot keep you here," he said. "Quiet. Final." Eleanor looked at Jesse one more time. The boy was staring at the floor, both shoulders pulled in, making himself as small as possible. He was 12 years old. He had done something wrong without understanding what it was part of. She could not hate him for that. She went to the back room and she packed her bag. She counted her coins. She sat on the cot for a moment and did not let herself think about England or about ships or about the house that had been full of people and then wasn't. She thought only about the next thing. The next thing was where to go. She pressed her fingers against the base of the suitcase. The document was still there, still sewn into the lining with her own small stitches in thread the same color as the fabric. She picked up the suitcase. She left Dry Creek before the morning lamps were lit. The mountain was harder this time. The trail wound upward into the pines as the cold turned from general to specific and the wind took on the particular personality of high altitude. The trees pressed in on both sides. She rode with the particular attention of someone who has decided not to think about the thing that is following them because thinking about it does not make it less true and does use up energy that is needed for the current problem. The current problem was the mountain. By the time Boone Ridge appeared at the top of a long clearing, the cabin with its stone chimney, the barn and fencing below a smaller structure near the creek, the shame that had been sitting in her chest since the mercantile had grown heavy enough to be a physical thing. Not shame at being accused. She had been accused of things before. The shame of needing to come here to this specific man to ask for something. She had asked for nothing from anyone in 11 months. The practice of asking had become foreign to her. Elias was splitting wood near the barn when she came through the gate. He set the axe down. He did not walk toward her. He just stood and looked at her the way he had looked at the town from the edge of it with full attention and no discernible reaction. Eleanor dismounted. She held the reins and she said it straight the way she said things when she was too tired to be careful. I lost my position. I can't go back to town. I can work, I can cook. Keep your books clean, repair anything that needs doing. I only need food and a place to sleep. Silence. She stood in it and did not fill it. He looked at her face for a moment, not at her clothing or her suitcase or the horse, at her face. She returned the look without shifting. Then he turned and nodded toward the small cabin near the creek. You can stay there, he said. Help with the ranch work and the accounts. She breathed. Thank you, she said. He had already picked up the axe. The first week at Boone Ridge was made of the specific kind of silence that exists between two people who have agreed not to speak about anything that matters yet. It was not uncomfortable. That was the thing Eleanor noticed first, that the silence between her and Elias was not the heavy pressured silence of two people avoiding something, but the functional silence of two people who had both decided that work was a more honest language than words and were communicating in it. She cleaned the small cabin. She replaced a broken shutter board with scrap timber she found near the barn. She mended the 3 wool blankets folded in the corner, each mended before with large practical stitches that suggested functional intent rather than care. She restitched them with smaller, closer work, not to show that she could, just because close stitches held longer. Elias brought firewood to her cabin without comment on the first morning. On the second, he left a sack of oats and a small pot of salt near her door. These were not gestures of welcome in any particular sense. They were the gestures of a man who had identified a need and addressed it in the most direct way available, which Eleanor found to her surprise more reassuring than warmth would have been. On the third day, she opened the main cabin's account ledgers. She sat at the worn table by the window and worked through them for 2 hours. At the end of 2 hours, she set down her pen and went out to find Elias near the north fence line, clearing deadfall from the pasture edge. You're being underpaid for your pelts, she said. The Helena buyer is giving you 30% below the current market rate. He stopped working, looked at her. How do you know the current market rate? There were papers in the bottom of the ledger box, 2 years of market reports. He was quiet for a moment. Carter mentioned the Helena buyer, said he was fair. Carter is not a trapper, Eleanor said. He doesn't read the fur market reports. Another pause. How much? She told him the number. He absorbed it, turned it over, nodded once, and went back to the deadfall. Eleanor returned to the cabin and finished the ledger entries. She did not know quite what she had expected, some acknowledgement, some change in the quality of his attention toward her. What she got was his continued unvarying silence, which she was beginning to understand was not indifference, but a specific kind of respect. He treated information the way he treated everything else at Boone Ridge, with the seriousness of something that had practical use without ceremony and without waste. She found after a few days that she had begun to move through the ranch with the same economy. Less talking, more doing. The rhythm of the place was entering her without her particularly inviting it. In the afternoons, when the work allowed it, she sat at the window of the small cabin with a book, one of the 3 she had carried from England. Outside, the creek moved past still liquid despite the cold running fast over pale stones. One afternoon in the second week, the rain came in from the north and she stayed inside, reading. The fire was low enough to cast a warm but not bright light. She had her feet tucked under her on the cot and the book open on her knees, and she was not thinking about anything in particular, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. A movement outside the window caught her attention. Elias was passing along the path between her cabin and the barn, heading toward the fence line on the far side of the pasture. He was moving at his usual pace, deliberate, unhurried, and had almost cleared her window when he stopped. He stood there just at the edge of her line of sight through the glass. She did not think he knew she was watching. He was not looking at the window. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a thing he has not allowed himself to look at for a long time and is not sure he should be looking at now. The light from inside the cabin, the warm, low lamp light that she hadn't thought twice about, fell through the window glass and lay across the path in front of him in a small specific rectangle. He stood still for a long time. Eleanor looked at his face through the glass. She could not read the expression entirely from this angle and in this light, but she understood the stillness of him, that he was not pausing to rest or think about the fence. He was pausing because something had stopped him. Something small and ordinary that had not been ordinary for him in a long time. She thought about the 3 crosses on the ridge above the cabin. She thought about what it meant to fill a space that had been empty for years, even briefly, even with only the light of a single lamp. She looked back down at her book. She did not read it. Outside, after another long moment, Elias moved on. His boots on the frozen ground made their ordinary sound as he walked away toward the pasture, and then there was only the rain and the creak and the small sound of the fire settling. Eleanor sat with the book open on her lap until the lamp burned low. She was still not thinking about anything in particular, but the nothing felt different than it had before. It was the wolves that broke what had quietly been building. They came 3 weeks into her time at Boone Ridge in the first hours of a moonless night. Eleanor woke to the sound of the sheep, a high distressed sound that was not their ordinary night noise, and sat up in the dark of her cabin, already aware that something was wrong before she was fully conscious. She heard Elias's door across the yard, then quick steps and a rifle being taken from its place. She pulled on her boots and her coat and took the lantern from the hook by the door and went out into the dark without stopping to think about whether she should. The night was black and very cold, and the sheep were moving in the enclosure with the specific panic of animals that have smelled something they fear. Elias was already at the fence. Rifle raised his attention on the darkness beyond the pasture edge where the tree line began. "Stay back," he said without turning. She went left instead of back, circling wide around the enclosure to reach the gate on the far side where the fence rail was lower. The lantern swept the ground ahead of her. The wolves were at the fence along the eastern edge, 3 of them that she could count, low and fast, testing the wire. Elias fired once into the air and they scattered, but only to the tree line, and she could see the yellow reflection of their eyes in the lantern light. In the confusion of the next few minutes, the sheep pressing in blind terror, the wolves returning in quick lunges, Elias moving along the fence line, Eleanor did not see the broken post until she was already at it. The wood had rotted through at the base, and the last ram, in his panicking, hit it at full weight. It came down, and Eleanor was directly behind it. The broken edge of the post caught her left forearm as she went down. She made a sound and kept the lantern up. That was the instinct: keep the light. Keep the light. And Elias was at her side. In the next breath, the wolves forgotten his hand on her arm already. "Let me see," he said. She sat on the cold ground and let him look. The cut was not deep, but it was bleeding freely, and she had landed hard on her shoulder when she went down. He took her inside the main cabin, which was where the medical supplies were. He cleaned the wound at the table by the lamp. She sat still and let him work, and it was while he was tying off the bandage that his hands stopped. He was looking at her forearm, just below the line of the cut where her sleeve had been pushed back to the elbow. The scar was old enough to have settled into her skin, pale against pale, no longer raw but unmistakable in shape. It was not an accident scar. It was a mark made deliberately with precision in the shape of a small crest. Eleanor reached to pull her sleeve down. His hand stopped her, not forcefully, just there. He looked at the mark for a long moment, then at her face. In his face she saw the moment of recognition, not slow, not gradual, but the sudden kind, like a door opening onto something already fully formed on the other side. "That's a noble crest," he said. His voice was entirely even. She looked at the fire. "You're mistaken." "I'm not." He released her arm. He sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she began to think he had decided to leave it. Then he said without looking at her, "8 years ago I spent 6 weeks in Helena working for a land office, filing documents mostly. A lawyer named Harton brought in a case involving foreign mineral rights. European." He paused. "There was a family name on the title deeds, and that crest on the seal." Eleanor looked at the fire for a long time. Outside, the wolves had gone. The sheep had quieted. The only sound was the wind moving past the cabin and the small sound of the burning wood. "Whitmore," she said finally, barely above a whisper. "Yes," said Elias. Another silence. Then Eleanor Marsh, who had not existed before 11 months ago, who had been built carefully from nothing to protect the person underneath her, sat at the table in a mountain cabin in Montana in the light of a man who had already seen more than she had meant for anyone to see and began to tell the truth. "Tap," she told him, "the way you tell things, you have carried alone for too long, not in careful order, not with the smooth edges of a story that has been rehearsed, but in the way that weight falls when you finally set it down, unevenly, with pauses in the wrong places, with certain words coming out harder than others because they had been pressed smaller than their actual size for a very long time. Her name was Isabella Whitmore, not Eleanor Marsh, not the widow from Philadelphia, not the careful, quiet woman who held teacups wrong and spoke with a not quite Philadelphia accent. Those were costumes she had made from necessity, each one more practiced than the last, each one a little more distant from the person wearing it. Her name was Isabella Whitmore, and she had been born in the west of England into a family whose wealth came from land and mining rights that had been held for 3 generations. Her father had been a practical man, not a titled man in the old sense, but a man of property and standing respected in the legal and commercial circles that made those things matter. Her mother had died when Isabella was 11. Her brother Edmund had been 4 years older than her and had taught her to ride and argued with her about books, and had been for most of her life the person she trusted most in the world. None of these people were alive anymore. Victor Harrow had been a business associate of her father's, or had presented himself as one. He was English by birth, European by operation, and he had an appetite for mineral rights, specifically for the kind of assets that were unglamorous and overlooked and worth a great deal more than anyone currently holding them realized. He had approached her father about the Whitmore mining interests twice in the course of 3 years, and both times her father had declined to sell. The second time, the refusal had been less polite. After that, things had begun to unravel. Not quickly. That was the part that still lived in Isabella's chest like a stone she could not dislodge, the slowness of it. False debt notices appearing from institutions her father had never borrowed from. Letters from lawyers he had never engaged. A judge who had handled the family's affairs for a decade suddenly recusing himself without explanation. Neighbors and business partners who had known the Whitmore family for 20 years beginning one by one to put distance between themselves and the family name. Her father had fought it. Edmund had fought it beside him. Isabella had watched the fighting and had understood from the specific quality of her father's face in the evenings when he did not know she was watching that something was wrong in a way that fighting would not fix. The attack on the house had come in November. A storm night, the kind that made Yorkshire feel like the edge of the world. 4 men. Her father and Edmund had been in the study when they arrived. The sounds Isabella had heard from the upper floor were sounds she had spent 11 months trying not to hear in sleep and had heard anyway. She had tried to run. She had not made it far. Harrow himself had come to the house the following morning after the men were gone, after the rooms were quiet in the way that rooms were quiet when they had been emptied of the people who had animated them. He had been polite. He had explained that the Whitmore estate was now subject to a number of legal claims, that he happened to be in a position to settle on her behalf, that the most sensible course of action for a young woman in her position was to cooperate fully with the process of transfer, and that her cooperation would be noted. The mark on her arm had come later. He had explained it also politely as a practical measure, so that if she was ever found somewhere she was not supposed to be, people would know who she belonged to. She had used the word belonged at the table in Elias's cabin, and her voice had stayed flat when she said it, which was the only way she knew how to say it, without the flatness she had spent a year building around that particular word cracking open. She had escaped 8 months after the attack. A servant named Greta, who had been with the family since before Isabella was born, had helped her, had provided money, a false name, passage papers, a route, had asked nothing in return except that Isabella write when she was safe somewhere. Isabella had written once from Halifax. She did not know if the letter had arrived. She did not know if Greta was still alive. From Halifax, she had moved west. From west, she had moved further west. She had stopped in 3 cities and left each one when she began to feel watched, which had happened each time within 2 months. Harrow's network was patient and methodical and not limited to England. She had understood this from the beginning. She had not understood until she was living inside it how many forms patience could take and how many shapes methodology could wear. She had arrived in Montana on the theory that the further you were from the center of something, the less of its gravity could reach you. She was not sure the theory held, but it was what she had. She stopped talking. The fire had burned down to coals while she spoke. The cabin was still warm, but the light was lower now, amber and close. Elias had not moved or interrupted for the entire length of her telling. He sat with his forearms on the table and his eyes on the middle distance and the particular stillness of a man who is thinking hard enough that everything else has gone quiet. She watched him. "The man in town," he said finally. "Kane." "Yes," she said. "I think so." "He arrived before you." "Yes." Elias was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "There's something else." It was not a question. She looked at the table. She had not told him everything. She had told him the part that explained the scar and the name and the running. She had not told him about the document in the base of her suitcase because that part connected him to the story in a way she had not yet decided how to navigate. "There's a list," she said. "I took it from Harrow's office before I left England. Before I left the house." She paused. His operation in England was not unique. He worked across territories wherever there were undervalued assets and people who could be removed from them without sufficient legal protection. Elias looked at her. "The list contains properties," she said. "Land, mineral rights ranches, places he had already cleared or was in the process of clearing." She kept her voice level. "Bitterroot Valley, Montana is on it. There is a name beside it." The silence in the cabin was very complete. "Elias Boone," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the window. Outside, the dark of the mountain was total. The 3 crosses on the ridge were invisible in it, but they were there. "My family," he said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know the full details," Isabella said. "The list only records the property, not the method, but the date beside your name is 9 years ago." 9 years. She watched him receive this. She had thought about how he would receive it in the hours before she came to Boone Ridge, and she had not been able to predict it. She had expected anger or grief or some combination of the two. What she saw was neither exactly. It was more like the expression of a man watching the last piece of something slot into a shape he had been living beside for years without being able to name it. Not surprise. Recognition. "I thought it was disease," he said very quietly. "The cattle first, then the winter, then the—" He stopped. "I thought I had simply failed to protect them." Isabella said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be adequate, and she had learned a long time ago that inadequate words were worse than silence. Elias sat with it for a while. The coals shifted in the stove. Outside, the wind moved past the cabin walls. Finally he said, "Does the list have enough detail to be used as evidence?" Isabella looked at him. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was not among them. "Potentially," she said carefully. "In the right hands, a federal authority, not local." He nodded. "Then we keep it safe." "We." She noted the word. She did not comment on it. He stood up and put more wood on the fire. He poured water into the pot for tea. He moved through these small tasks with the same efficiency he brought to everything at Boone Ridge. And Isabella sat at the table and watched him and understood something about this man that she had been approaching for weeks without quite reaching. He was not undone by difficulty. He had been made by it in the specific way that some people are made by what breaks them, not harder exactly, but more settled, certain of very little except the next necessary thing, which was perhaps the most honest way to be certain about anything at all. After that night, things at Boone Ridge changed in a way that was not large and visible, but was entirely real. They did not speak about what she had told him again, not immediately, not in the days that followed. The story had been said and heard and received, and now it existed in the space between them as simply as the tools on the wall and the 3 crosses on the ridge. It did not need to be repeated. What changed was the quality of the work they did together. Before, it had been parallel, 2 people doing their separate tasks in the same space, connected by practical necessity. After, it was something else. When Elias pointed out a section of fence that needed reinforcing before the winter deepened, Isabella looked at it and suggested a specific method she had read about in one of the engineering journals she had found pressed into the back of the ledger shelf. When Isabella noted that the trade records for the past 2 years showed a pattern of consistent shortfall in the late autumn cattle sales, Elias confirmed without surprise that the buyer had always sent someone on his behalf in October, never coming himself. "I'll go to Helena in the spring," he said, "directly to the market." "I can write the correspondence," Isabella said. "Formal letters carry more weight than a man arriving without prior notice." He looked at her. "You can write that kind of letter." She held his gaze. "I went to school for it." A pause. "I know," he said, and the specific weight he gave those 2 words told her that he had known for longer than the night she told him her name. She decided not to ask how long. The question that had lived in her since the beginning, how much he had known and when, was one she had been afraid to ask because she was not sure she could afford the answer. Not because she feared what he had done with the knowing, but because she was not ready for the examination of her own reaction to finding that he had known and stayed quiet and let her arrive at truth in her own time. That was a specific kind of respect she had not received from many people and was not sure she knew how to hold yet. November came to the Bitterroot with the full weight of its authority. The passes north of Boone Ridge closed to reliable travel. The creek beside Isabella's cabin developed a skin of ice each morning that the afternoon sun thinned but never quite eliminated. The cattle retreated from the upper pasture to the sheltered ground near the barn, and Elias spent the first 2 weeks of the month laying in the last of the winter feed and reinforcing the barn walls against the wind that came down from the high slopes at night. Isabella learned things she had not known before. She learned how to read the sky in a way that was not metaphorical, the specific angle of a cloud formation that meant snow within 4 hours, the quality of wind that meant cold without snow, the color that the light turned on the mountain when the temperature was about to drop below the survivable margin. She learned it from Elias in the way he taught everything, which was by showing rather than explaining, and then waiting to see what she made of it. She learned how to split wood correctly, not with force, but with placement, finding the grain of the wood and letting the weight of the axe do the work rather than driving it down with her shoulders. She was not good at it yet. She was improving. She learned that the small grey cat who had been living under the barn since before she arrived had 3 kittens hidden in the hay bales, and that Elias knew about them and had been leaving small pieces of dried meat near the barn door for 6 weeks without mentioning it. She told him she had found them. He nodded. "They'll be good barn cats by spring." "You've been feeding them?" He picked up the axe. "They were hungry." She stood watching him for a moment. There was something in this small fact, the months of quiet care for creatures he had not told anyone about, that seemed to say more about him than most of the words she had exchanged with him combined. She filed it with the other things she was accumulating, the small pieces of Elias Boone that did not announce themselves, that you only found if you paid the specific kind of attention she had trained herself to pay. She went back to work. One afternoon in the second week of November, the rain came in from the north, and the temperature dropped fast enough that the rain became sleet before it reached the valley. Isabella stayed inside the small cabin with a fire going and the lamp lit, and one of the books she had carried from England open on her knees. She was not reading. She was thinking about the document in the base of the suitcase. She had checked it that morning, as she checked it every few days, not because she was afraid it would disappear, but because the habit of checking had become a way of reminding herself why she was still moving, still building the next version of her life, rather than stopping. The list was not only damaging to Victor Harrow, it was potentially protective. If it reached the right authority, it could provide legal grounds for the recovery of assets for the investigation of deaths that had been classified as accidents. Her father, Edmund, a dozen families on other pages of that list whose names she did not know but whose losses were documented in the cold shorthand of property records. She was thinking about this when she looked up at the window and saw Elias. He was walking along the path between her cabin and the barn, heading toward the far fence line. He was moving at his usual pace, and in the sleet he had his head down, his coat collar up against the wind. He was almost past her window when he stopped. He stood at the edge of her sight through the glass. She could see the light from her cabin falling across the ground in front of him, the warm rectangle of lamplight lying on the cold, wet path. He was not looking at the window exactly. He was looking at the light. He stood very still. Isabella watched him through the glass. She thought about the 3 crosses on the ridge, and what 9 years of that particular solitude felt like from the inside, the mornings counting 30 seconds in front of what you had lost, the evenings in a cabin that had been built for more people than it currently held, the accumulated weight of all the ordinary moments that no longer had anyone to share them with. The lamplight from her cabin was a small thing, but small things, she had learned, were what the large silences were made of and what they were broken by. She held very still. She did not move to the window. She did not want him to see that she had seen, because she understood the same way she understood the document hidden in the suitcase that some things needed to be held carefully. After a long moment, Elias walked on. Isabella looked at the page of the open book and did not read a word. The letter arrived in Dry Creek in the 3rd week of November, carried by a post rider from Helena, along with a bundle of supply orders and a newspaper 3 weeks out of date. Aldous Kane received it at the boarding house and read it in his room with the door locked. He sat at the writing desk afterward for a long time without writing anything. The letter was from Victor Harrow, written in the clipped, precise hand that Kane had come to associate with instructions that were polite in form and not polite in substance. It told him that Harrow's timeline had accelerated. It told him that Harrow himself was now traveling west and would arrive in Dry Creek within the month. It told Kane that his work in the town had been satisfactory and that additional resources would be provided upon Harrow's arrival. It also told him that the woman had been located. Kane read that sentence twice. He had done his work. He had arrived in Dry Creek 3 weeks before her, mapped the social geography, established himself in a position of trust, written his letters. He had arranged the matter of the necklace, which had proceeded as planned. He had provided Harrow's network with a current account of the town's people and properties. He had not known until this moment that the matter of the necklace had been intended not simply to remove the woman from the town, but to push her somewhere specific. That her displacement had been calculated rather than incidental. That Boone Ridge had been the destination all along. He sat at the desk and looked at the letter. He had been working for Victor Harrow for 6 years. He had done things in those 6 years that he did not examine closely, because examining them closely produced a discomfort that he had found it more practical to avoid than to address. He was not a violent man. He was a useful man, which was not the same thing, but which he had allowed himself to believe was different enough to matter. He looked at the letter. He thought about Eleanor Marsh, about the quality of her stillness at the counter when he asked her questions, about the way she had looked at him from across the store with an expression of someone who had already placed him correctly and had decided not to say so. He thought about the boy Jesse, who had been paid $2 for a simple errand and who had been white-faced with guilt for a week afterward. He thought about what it meant that Harrow was coming. Harrow did not travel for properties he could acquire through correspondence. He traveled when he required something that could only be obtained through direct pressure. He traveled when the final step needed to be taken in person. Kane folded the letter. He placed it in the stove in his room and watched it burn. Then he sat very still for a long time, thinking about the kind of man he had been and the kind of man he would need to be in order to do what he was considering. He had not made up his mind yet, but the fact that he was considering it at all told him something had shifted. Victor Harrow arrived in Dry Creek on the first day of December. 3 carriages. The horses were the finest animals anyone in the valley had seen. tall, dark, with the particular quality of coat that comes from expensive feed and careful handling. The carriages themselves were black and polished to a finish that caught the flat winter light and threw it back in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if the shine were itself a message. I have come from somewhere with more resources than this place, and I intend you to know it. Harrow stepped down from the lead carriage and stood on the main street of Dry Creek with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done this many times in many places and understood that the first minute was the most important. He removed his gloves. He looked at the buildings on both sides of the street, not dismissively, but assessingly the way a man looks at a piece of land he is thinking about purchasing. Then he smiled. The smile was good. It was the kind of smile that a certain kind of man learns to produce with genuine mechanical precision, warm enough to feel spontaneous, controlled enough never to mean more than he intended. Kane, watching from the doorway of the boarding house, recognized it immediately. He had been on the right side of that smile for 6 years. He was beginning to understand what it felt like from the other side. Harrow's first evening in Dry Creek was spent at the saloon where he had arranged a gathering. Not a formal meeting, but the informal kind that was more effective, the kind where food and drink appeared, and a man with a pleasant voice talked about the future and let people's own hopes fill in the details he deliberately left empty. He talked about silver. He talked about untapped deposits in the Bitterroot Range. He spoke of roads and investment and the kind of future that a valley like this one could have if the right people believed in it enough to act. The men of Dry Creek listened with the hungry attention of people who had been working hard ground for a long time and had never quite been offered a shortcut to not needing to. Kane stood at the back of the room and watched faces and said nothing. 3 days after Harrow's arrival, Isabella rode down from Boone Ridge for supplies. She needed salt and candle stock and a new file for the saw that had worn down during the fall work. She planned to be in and out of the mercantile in 20 minutes. She tied her horse outside Carter's store. She picked up the basket she had brought from the tack room. She stepped onto the wooden walkway. And then she stopped. Victor Harrow was standing 40 feet away beneath the awning of the building opposite, speaking with Samuel Carter and 2 men she did not know. He was wearing a dark coat with a fine weave that she had seen before. Not this coat specifically, but coats of its type from a tailor on a street in London she would not let herself name. He had his back partially turned to her, and his right hand was moving in the small, precise gestures of a man making a point he considered already established. On the 3rd finger of his right hand was the signet ring. She had last seen that ring pressed against the inside of her forearm. The world went very quiet. The sounds of Dry Creek, the wind, the distant metallic ring from the blacksmith's shop, the conversation of 2 women near the well all became very small and very far away, as if she were hearing them through several walls. She could not breathe properly. She was aware of this in a clinical way, the same clinical awareness with which she had observed herself freezing in the snow, her body doing something her mind could not fully override. Her basket was in her hand. She was standing on the walkway. If she moved now quickly, but not running, she could be at the horse and gone before he turned around. She moved. Not running. The not running required everything she had, every year of practice at walking through rooms where she was afraid and showing nothing every month of learning how to move through a world that was watching her without letting the watching change her gait. She reached the horse. She untied the reins. She mounted. She did not look back. She rode out of Dry Creek at the pace of a woman who had completed her errand and was heading home and had nothing whatsoever to be afraid of. She maintained that pace until the town was out of sight. Then she rode as fast as the mountain trail allowed. Elias was at the sheep fence when he heard the horse coming too fast up the mountain road. He set down the wire tool and watched the gap in the tree line where the trail emerged. The horse came through it at a canter that was wrong, for the trail too fast, the rider's weight too far forward, both of them breathing hard. He walked toward the gate. Isabella pulled up in the yard and dismounted, and her legs nearly went out from under her as she touched the ground. He was there before she fell, one hand on her arm steadying. She was white, not the white of cold he had seen that on her face once before. This was different. This was the white of a specific kind of fear that had nothing to do with temperature. He guided her inside the cabin and set water to heat and sat across from her and waited. She pressed her hands flat against the table. She breathed. After a long time, she said, "He's here." Elias did not ask who. He watched her face and let the silence hold her until she was ready to continue. "Victor Harrow," she said, "in Dry Creek. 3 carriages, men with him." She looked up. "He didn't come for silver. He came because someone told him where I am." Elias thought about Cain. He thought about the letter that had gone out 3 days after Isabella arrived and the specific quality of attention the minister had paid her from the first day. He thought about the necklace in the mercantile and the boy Jesse's white face. "Cain told him," he said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "But that's not all." She looked at the table. "Harrow doesn't come in person for people. He comes for assets. He thinks I have something he needs." "The list," Elias said. "The list proves what he did, in England and here. If it reaches a federal authority, a real one, not local, it's enough to bring criminal charges." She looked up at him. "That's what he's here for. Not me. The document." Elias sat with this. He turned it over carefully, the way he turned over problems that had practical implications. Not emotionally, but systematically, looking at the shape of the thing and where its weight was and how it could be moved. "He'll go through the town first," he said. "Money and promises. He'll make people need him to succeed before he takes anything by force." He paused. "He'll come for Boone Ridge last. And he'll come with the town already on his side." Isabella nodded. She had seen this before. She knew the pattern. "Then we need to act before he's finished building his position," she said. Her voice had steadied. The fear was still in her. He could see it in the precise way she held herself, the extra effort it was taking to maintain her posture, but it was no longer driving. She had put it back where she kept it, in the place where the things that could not be resolved yet were stored. He recognized that location. He had a similar one. "Tell me what you know about him," Elias said. "Not the history, the method. How he moves." Isabella looked at him across the table in the cabin that had been built for more people than it currently held in the mountains, that kept nothing except what was true and practical and necessary. And she began to think out loud for the first time since she had arrived in Montana, not performing calm, not managing what she showed, but actually thinking in the company of someone she had decided without quite marking the moment of the decision she trusted. "He never lets anyone see what he values most," she said. "He lets them see what he wants them to think he values. The silver story is not about silver." She paused. "He will say everything he does here is about the land or the mining rights, but what he came for is the document. Which means he needs me. Which means he won't move directly against Boone Ridge until he knows where the document is," Elias said. "Yes." "Which gives us time." "A small amount." They looked at each other across the table. Outside, the first snow of December was beginning to fall quiet, unhurried, covering the yard and the fence line and the path between the cabins with the patient white of something that did not need to hurry because it intended to stay. Elias reached across the table and turned the lamp up. "Then we use the time we have," he said. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of difficult. Not the open violent difficult of a storm or an attack, but the quiet difficult of waiting while something assembled itself just beyond your view. Harrow's presence in Dry Creek began to change the town in small ways that accumulated. A rancher who had always nodded to Elias on the street now found something to look at on the other side of the road. A land dispute that had been dormant for 2 years was suddenly being discussed again, with Harrow's name appearing in relation to it. The sheriff, a practical man named Oakes, who had managed Dry Creek's modest troubles for 15 years, began wearing a new pocket watch that he had not owned before Harrow arrived. Elias went to town twice in December for supplies. Both times, he reported back to Isabella with the specificity of a man who had spent 9 years reading a landscape. "He's buying loyalty," he said on the second return, "not with contracts, with possibility. He tells people what they could have. Then he makes them feel that I'm the obstacle." "The land," Isabella said. "Boone Ridge sits above the valley. If you wanted to control the water rights for the whole lower region—" He stopped. "It's not about silver. It never was." "No," Isabella said. "It wasn't." She had known this since the day she rode out of Dry Creek with her heart pounding. Harrow did not go anywhere for a single purpose. He arrived in a place and he mapped it, and he took everything that could be taken in the order that made the taking easiest. She was one item on a list of items. The document was the key that locked the list shut or opened it. She had the document. He needed it, and he needed her to not be in a position to use it. These facts had a geometry, and geometry she had learned from her father's surveying books in the library she was not going to think about could be worked with. He'll send someone to the ranch, she said. Before he comes himself, he'll want to know the terrain. He already has, Elias said. He set down the supplies he had brought back. 2 men rode up the North Trail 3 days ago. I found their tracks near the eastern fence line. She looked at him. You didn't say. I'm saying now. She breathed. He's mapping us. Yes. She stood and walked to the window and looked out at the winter yard, the barn, the fence lines, the shapes of the mountains, pressing close on 3 sides. Then we need to stop waiting to be mapped, she said. We need to be the ones who know the terrain. Elias stood behind her, looking out the same window at the same yard. I know a place in the mountains, he said, a pass about 4 miles north and west of here. Raven's Pass, the old trappers called it. I've never taken anyone there. Isabella turned to look at him. It's the kind of place, he said carefully, where a man who thought he was hunting becomes something else. She held his gaze for a moment. Tell me about it, she said. And Elias Boone, who had lived alone for 9 years and spoken only what was strictly necessary and had not told another person about Raven's Pass since the day he had found it, pulled out the rough map from the shelf where he kept the trapline records and spread it on the table and began to talk. 3 days before they intended to set the plan in motion, Aldous Kane came to Boone Ridge. He arrived on foot, which was the first unusual thing. He came up the North Trail through the pines in the early afternoon, moving fast but not quite running, and when Elias opened the cabin door before Kane had reached the porch steps, the minister stopped and put both hands out at his sides, the gesture of a man who wants to make very clear he is not carrying anything threatening. He looked worse than Elias had ever seen him. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there before Harrow arrived, and his coat was buttoned wrong on one side, which suggested a man who had dressed in a hurry or in poor light or with his mind entirely elsewhere. I need to speak with you, Kane said. Both of you. Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. Isabella was at the table with the map spread in front of her, and when Kane came in, she rose and looked at him with the specific quality of attention she reserved for people she was still deciding about, steady, unhurried, neither welcoming nor hostile. Kane sat down when Elias indicated the chair. He put his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. I came ahead of Harrow, he said. He doesn't know I'm here. He looked up at Isabella. He knows about the document. Not where it is, but he knows you have it and he knows what it contains. Isabella said nothing. He told me 2 nights ago, Kane continued. He was satisfied, I think is the word. He said the document would allow him to close out several outstanding matters. The word matters was delivered in a particular tone, the tone of a man recognizing possibly for the first time the full weight of a word he had been using loosely. You arranged the necklace, Elias said. Kane's jaw tightened. Yes? You sent letters to Harrow about Miss Marsh's whereabouts. Yes. Elias watched him. So, why are you here now? Kane was quiet for a moment. He seemed to be choosing between several versions of the answer and settling finally on the one that was least flattering to himself. Because he told me what happened in England, Kane said. To her family. He didn't look at Isabella when he said it. I knew Harrow removed obstacles. I understood that in general terms, and I chose not to understand it in specific ones. He told me the specific ones 2 nights ago, and He stopped. I have been a useful man to a very bad one, and I told myself the usefulness was neutral. It was not neutral. The room was quiet. Isabella looked at him across the table with the expression of someone who has been given a confession that is true and is deciding whether truth is enough. What does he plan? She said. Kane told them. Harrow intended to move against Boone Ridge within the week. He had already spoken with the sheriff and 2 of the larger landowners in the valley, establishing a legal pretext, a disputed water claim that had been dormant for years, now suddenly revived with Harrow's lawyers behind it. The move against the ranch would appear to be a legal proceeding. It would not be. He needed Isabella and the document. If she produced it voluntarily, the rest would proceed more quietly. If she did not, the result would be the same, but the path would be less quiet. He said it that clearly, Elias asked. He said it to someone he believed was entirely loyal, Kane said. He was not being careful. Elias looked at Isabella. She was looking at the map on the table. At the marks she had made on it over the past 3 days, the entry points to Raven's Pass. The ridge lines the choke point where the canyon walls pressed closest together. How many men does he intend to bring? She asked. 6, Kane said. Armed. He'll come himself. He always comes himself, she said quietly. Kane looked at her. I can be a witness, he said, to what he told me, to what I know of his operations. I have letters, copies of communications I kept because... He paused. I kept them because some part of me knew I would need them eventually. Isabella looked at him for a long time. If you testify against him, she said, you implicate yourself. Yes. You would face legal consequences. Yes. He met her eyes steadily. I am aware of that. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she looked at Elias. Something passed between them, brief, certain, the communication of two people who had spent enough time in the same silence to have developed a shorthand for it. Elias looked back at Kane. There's a federal circuit judge who passes through Helena in February, he said. He's the one man in this territory Harrow's money hasn't reached yet. I know this because he ruled against one of Harrow's associated claims last spring. He paused. If we can get Isabella and the document to Helena in February with your testimony supporting the claim, it's enough. Kane nodded slowly. I know the judge's name. I know it because Harrow mentioned him once as a problem to be managed. Has he been managed? Not yet. That was the next thing on the list. Elias stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the winter afternoon, at the last of the light on the mountain slopes, at the long shadows falling across the yard. They had perhaps 4 days before Harrow moved. 4 days to prepare a trap for a man who had been setting traps for 30 years and had never to anyone's knowledge walked into one. He thought about the canyon. He thought about the specific weight of each boulder he had identified along the ridge above the choke point, the way the freeze-thaw cycles of 9 Montana winters had been doing the slow work of loosening them from the cliff face. He thought about the way sound moved strangely in Raven's Pass, echoing and twisting, making it nearly impossible to locate a shooter by sound alone. He thought about Isabella saying he never lets anyone see what he values most. And he thought about the map on the table and the document hidden in the suitcase and the 3 crosses on the ridge above the cabin and the particular geometry of a situation where the only thing you have that the other person needs is also the only thing you cannot give up. He turned back from the window. We'll need to move tomorrow, he said, to set the lines in the pass before the ground freezes harder. He looked at Isabella. You'll need to do the part I can't. She looked at him steadily. The rumor. Yes. It has to start in town tonight, and it has to be specific enough to be convincing, but not so specific that it sounds placed. He paused. It has to sound like something he was meant to overhear. Isabella was already thinking. He could see it in her face, not the controlled blankness she wore in town, but the real working expression, the one that came out when she was using the mind she had spent years trying to hide. Silver, she said. Raven's Pass. And the idea that you're moving quickly, that you've already contacted someone in Helena and they're sending a man west within the week. She looked up. He won't wait if he thinks someone else might get there first. That is his specific weakness. He cannot tolerate being second. You know that from experience, Elias said. I know it from watching him destroy my family, she said. Flat, factual, the way she said the things that were the most true. Kane stood up from his chair. He looked older than when he had come in, which was the effect that honesty sometimes had on people who had been postponing it. Tell me what you need me to do, he said. Elias looked at him for a long moment. This was a man who had done harm and was now proposing to undo some portion of it, and the question was not whether the harm could be undone, it could not entirely, but whether the undoing was genuine and whether it was useful. He decided it was both. Go back to town, he said. Tonight at the saloon mention that you passed Boone Ridge on your way back from a ranch call to the north. That you heard Elias Boone telling a hand something about the western ridge. That Boone seemed agitated, purposeful, like a man who had just confirmed something he had been looking for. Kane nodded slowly. Nothing more than that, Elias said. Let the rest grow on its own. Harrow's men will fill in what they want to believe. Kane picked up his hat from the table. He looked at Isabella one more time. She returned the look without warmth, but without hostility, the look of a woman who was reserving judgment until she had more evidence than a single afternoon of apparent honesty. He walked to the door, then he stopped and said without turning, "For what it's worth, I am sorry. I know that is a very small thing set against a very large one." Isabella said nothing. Cain went out into the cold afternoon and walked back down the mountain toward Dry Creek. Elias closed the door and turned back to the cabin. Isabella was looking at the map. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "Enough," Elias said. She nodded once. It was the same answer she had arrived at. They went back to the map and the preparations and the careful, necessary work of people who were done waiting for the world to happen to them and had decided instead to happen to it. They worked through the night before and all of the following day. Elias went up to Raven's Pass alone on the first morning before the light was fully established, while the stars were still visible above the canyon rim, and spent 6 hours doing what he had been preparing to do in his mind for the 3 days since they had decided on the plan. He moved along the ridge above the choke point, testing each boulder he had identified, feeling for the specific looseness that meant the freeze-thaw cycles had done enough work. 2 of the 5 he had marked were ready. The other 3 needed help. He worked carefully and without hurry. He rigged lines of rope behind the boulders, running each line back to a single anchor point farther along the ridge, a pine root system that had grown into the rock face over decades and was solid in a way that nothing else on the loose upper slope was solid. The lines were designed to stabilize the boulders temporarily, like fingers holding something in place, so that a single cut at the anchor point would release them all at once. He tested each rope. He traced each line back to the anchor. He cut nothing yet. Then he walked the canyon floor from end to end, learning it again in the particular way that people who are preparing to move through dangerous ground at speed need to learn it not as scenery but as sequence. Left turn behind the second boulder cluster. 3 strides to the narrow gap in the west wall. The overhang at the north end that provided complete cover from above. The placement of each shadow at each hour as the sun moved across the canyon rim. He had been in this pass dozens of times over 9 years. He knew it differently now. He was knowing it the way you know the inside of a house you are about to defend. Isabella came up to the pass on the second afternoon after she had been to town. She had ridden into Dry Creek that morning alone, done a small amount of shopping at the mercantile, new candles, a length of cord, a tin of coffee, and had managed in the course of 2 conversations and 1 overheard exchange to accomplish what they had planned. She had not sought out Harrow's men. She had not needed to. In a town that size, the men Harrow employed were simply present, visible in the way that men who are watching a place are always slightly more visible than they intend to be. She had said in a conversation with a woman near the well that she was spending the next few days managing accounts at the ranch and would not be in town for a while, that there was a great deal to organize before the end of the year, that Mr. Boone had been, she had paused as if choosing a word, busy, with something on the western ridge. She had let the pause do its work and moved on. When she arrived at Raven's Pass and saw what Elias had built in the canyon, she stood at the entrance for a moment and looked at it, the way she had looked at everything at Boone Ridge on the first day, really looking, assessing, understanding. Then she climbed to the observation point on the eastern ridge and looked down at the angles and the sight lines and began to understand her part of the plan in the specific physical way that a plan becomes real when you put your body in the place where it will need to be. She was a good shot. She had not advertised this. She had learned in a period of her life she did not discuss from a gamekeeper on the Whitmore estate who had understood before she did that there might come a time when knowing how to be accurate with a rifle was a more practical skill than embroidery. She had practiced in secret for 3 years before the world had confirmed the gamekeeper's judgment. She lay on the cold rock of the eastern ridge and looked down through the iron sights at the canyon floor and confirmed the distances and the angles and the specific points of cover that she and Elias had marked on the map. They were ready, or as ready as 2 people could be against 6 armed men and the kind of adversary who had been doing this for 30 years. Harrow left Dry Creek before dawn on the 4th day. He rode at the head of his men, 6 of them, as Cain had said, with rifles across their saddles, and the particular posture of men who were being paid to be prepared for something unpleasant. They rode without lamps, which was either caution or confidence or both, and they followed the trail north toward the Bitterroot Range in the specific silence of men who have been given a clear objective and are moving toward it. Harrow rode straight-backed, as always. He wore a riding coat rather than his usual fine wool, a concession to the terrain, but still well-made, still immaculate. He had dressed for the meeting at Raven's Pass the way he dressed for everything, as a man who expected his appearance to settle the question of who was in control before any words were exchanged. He was not a stupid man. He had not become what he was by being stupid. But he had a specific and durable blind spot, which was that he believed other people's intelligence was always a smaller, slower version of his own, and that patience was a virtue he possessed exclusively. The false trail Elias had left was well made. Disturbed earth along the path to the pass. A piece of pale stone, the kind that caught the light in a way that suggested mineral content, left near the trailhead where a man with a lamp would see it without needing to look for it. The specific evidence of someone who had been digging along one of the canyon walls. The marks of tools in the rock face. The small heap of spoil placed deliberately in plain sight. The first man into the canyon noticed it and called it to Harrow's attention. "Boone was working here," he said. "Recent." Harrow nodded with the satisfaction of a man confirming what he already knew and pressed forward. Elias was on the western ridge when they entered the pass. He had been in position since before first light, lying flat on the cold rock in a place that gave him a full view of the canyon entrance and the choke point without exposing him to sight from below. He was still. He had learned to be still for long periods in his years on the trap line, the kind of stillness that was not forced or effortful, but simply the body in its natural quiet state, waiting. He counted the riders as they entered. 6 men plus Harrow. 7. He waited until the last horse had passed through the narrow entrance at the south end of the canyon. He watched them move deeper in following the false trail, passing the rock marks, moving toward the north end where the canyon walls pressed closest and the floor was too narrow for the horses to pass abreast. He let them get all the way in. Then he cut the line. The sound began as a single sharp report, the rope under tension releasing at the anchor point, and then the mountain contributed its own voice to the event. The boulders came down the slope in sequence. The first loosening, the second, dislodging the third, until the entire upper section of the western rim was moving, and the canyon filled with a roar that was not quite the sound of thunder and not quite the sound of water, but was somewhere in between and larger than both. The entrance behind Harrow's group disappeared beneath tons of pale stone. The dust came up in a wall. The horses screamed. 3 of the 6 armed men were thrown immediately as their horses panicked and spun. A 4th man tried to control his animal and managed it for about 4 seconds before the horse went sideways into the canyon wall. Harrow himself stayed mounted. He was a good horseman. He pulled his horse around in the dust and chaos and looked at where the canyon entrance had been and understood immediately. "Hold formation," he called, and his voice was steady, which was a kind of courage, even if it was the courage of a man who caused damage for a living and was accustomed to being present when damage was done. The first rifle shot came from the shadows to the north. One of the armed men dropped from his horse. The canyon erupted. Harrow's men fired back, blind into the dust and the dark, their shots ricocheting off the stone walls with sounds that multiplied and echoed until it was impossible to tell how many rifles were firing or from which direction. This was what Raven's Pass did to sound. This was why Elias had chosen it. He moved after each shot. He was never in the same place twice. He used the narrow gaps between boulder clusters, the overhang at the north end, the shadow of the west wall where the morning light had not yet reached. He fired at targets, not at movement, waiting for the moment of clarity when a man stepped into an open line and presented himself, then firing once and moving before the echo had finished. 3 of Harrow's men were down or out of the fight within the first minutes. The remaining 2 were more careful. They had found cover behind a large boulder cluster near the center of the canyon floor and were firing in coordinated patterns, one drawing attention while the other moved. They had done this before. They were the ones Harrow paid most probably, and they were earning it now. From the eastern ridge, Isabella saw them. She had been watching since the moment the boulders came down, tracking the movement in the dust and chaos below, keeping her attention on the full picture rather than any single point. When the two men began working in coordination, she identified them immediately, the way one waited while the other moved the specific arc of ground they were covering toward Elias's last position. Her hands were cold. The rock under her elbows was cold. She adjusted her position and looked through the sights and made herself breathe, the way she had been taught, not holding it but slowing it, letting the heartbeat find its own rhythm between the beats. The first man appeared between the two boulders at the moment she had calculated he would based on the rhythm of the pair's movement. She fired. The recoil pushed her back a few inches on the cold rock. Below, the man went down hard. The second man spun immediately looking for the source. He could not locate it. The canyon walls were stealing the direction of the sound, sending it back from 3 different angles. He fired toward the ridge in a general way and then moved trying to reach higher ground. She fired again before he reached it. The canyon went quiet. Elias had heard both of her shots and had tracked their results without stopping. He was already moving toward the north end of the canyon, where 2 of the remaining men had retreated into the natural crevice in the west wall. Not good cover for a fight, but enough to stop moving. One came out with his hands up before Elias reached him. The other hesitated and then did the same. Elias told them to stay where they were and looked at the canyon. 6 men down or surrendered. 1 left. He turned and scanned. Harrow was not where he had been. Elias stood very still and used the silence the way he had used it for 9 years, not as absence, but as information. He listened past the horses, past the sound of the 2 surrendered men breathing hard against the canyon wall, past the wind moving through the pass above his head. A scrape of boot on rock. Above him and to the right. Not the canyon floor. The eastern slope. He understood immediately. Harrow had found the path up to the ridge, one of the narrow crevice paths that looked from below like they led nowhere and in fact led to the observation points he and Isabella had used while planning. The observation point where Isabella was. He moved. Isabella had lost sight of the canyon floor when she moved forward to take her second shot, and she had been repositioning when the sound behind her registered not the sound of wind or settling rock, but the specific sound of a boot placed quickly on loose stone. She turned. Harrow was 6 feet away, having come up over the lip of the ridge from the narrow path on the south side that she had not thought to watch because she had been watching the canyon. He was breathing hard from the climb. His hat was gone. There was a long scrape of dust across his coat that told her he had climbed on hands and knees for the last section. But the revolver in his hand was steady. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the one she remembered from the morning after the attack on the house in England. The polite, considered expression of a man who had arrived at a desired destination and was now determining the most efficient way to conclude the visit. "Miss Whitmore," he said. He had not called her that in 11 months. The name hit her the way he had intended it to, as a reclamation, a reassertion of the category he had placed her in on that morning in England. His right hand came up and she saw the ring. She held herself very still. "The document," he said. "I know you have it. I know it came from my office. I know exactly which evening it went missing, and I know which servant helped you, and for the record, she was dealt with before your ship left port." He watched her face when he said this and saw what he was looking for. "Yes, Greta, very loyal, unhelpfully so." Isabella did not move. Inside, she was in 2 places at once, the cold rock of the ridge in Montana and a morning in Yorkshire, in a kitchen that smelled of bread and coal smoke, with a small woman who had placed a folded package in her hands and said nothing except "go." Harrow stepped closer. "You give me the document," he said, "and we conclude this without additional unpleasantness. You are after all a practical woman, you've demonstrated that. 11 months of running across 2 continents, that is a practically minded person." She said nothing. "Oh," he continued, "you make this difficult, in which case the outcome is the same but the path is longer." He tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man explaining something to someone slower than himself. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Miss Whitmore. No one has ever made the path the right choice." From below she heard boots on the canyon floor, moving fast. Harrow heard it too. He glanced down quickly and then back at her. "Call him off," he said. She said nothing. His jaw tightened slightly, the first departure from the perfect composure. "I will shoot you and wait for him to come up here after you. The result is the same." "Elias," she called. Harrow's expression shifted towards satisfaction. "Tell him to stop," Harrow said. "Harrow is on the ridge," she called down. "He has a gun on me. He wants you to stop." Harrow looked at her. This was not what he had told her to say. He studied her expression, trying to calculate what she had done and why. "Stop moving," he called down, his voice carrying over the ridge edge. "Or she told me where you are." Elias's voice came up from below, closer than Harrow had expected. "And I know this ridge, every step of it." Harrow pulled Isabella in front of him, one arm across her shoulders, the revolver against her temple. His back to the canyon, his feet on rock he did not know. "Stay where you are, Boone," he said. "I'll walk her out of here and no one follows. Simple." Elias's voice came up again, even, unhurried. "You came here for a document. Before you leave, I want you to know something." Harrow waited. "My wife's name was Catherine," Elias said. "My daughters were Ruth and May. Ruth was 7, May was 4. A pause. "Your name is on the list beside theirs," Elias said. The same list, the same handwriting, the same date. Something passed across Harrow's face. Not guilt, not quite, but the recognition of something he had not expected to have said back to him. He had done so many of these transactions over 30 years that the individual names had long since stopped registering. The fact that one of them was standing below the ridge and saying those names aloud, that was an anomaly he had not prepared for. "Drop the gun," Isabella said quietly. He tightened his arm. "Quiet." "You told me in England that I belonged to you," she said. "You put a mark on my arm to prove it." She was looking straight ahead at the sky above the canyon, speaking as if he were not pressing a gun against her head. "You have spent 11 months hunting me because you believe that is still true." "It is. You are standing on the edge of a ridge. You don't know. In a canyon, you don't know, with 6 men down and 1 woman who has spent 11 months learning how to stop running." She paused. "Put the gun down." Harrow laughed short, dry. "That's not how this..." He shifted his weight back and the ground under his rear foot simply was not there. The frost had worked at the edge of the outcrop through the night. Elias had not needed to prepare it. The mountain had done the work on its own in the slow, methodical way the Bitterroot did everything, without announcement, without drama, without hurry. The stone cracked. His balance went. He reached for the rock face with his gun hand and found nothing. Isabella had already moved forward and to the left, the way she had taught herself to move toward the danger rather than away from it, because away was where you ended up pinned, and forward was where you ended up with options. She heard the sound he made. She did not look back. Elias came over the ridge edge a moment later and found her standing with her back to the drop, looking at him with the expression of someone who has just used everything they have and is now waiting to find out if it was enough. He looked at her face. He looked past her at the rubble below. He looked back at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. And then, because it was true and because it was the first time she had been able to say it and mean it without qualification, "I'm not." He nodded once. Below in the canyon, the 2 surrendered men were still against the wall. The horses had settled. The dust was beginning to clear, revealing the pale stone of the walls and the cold blue of the December sky above. Raven's Pass was quiet. The 2 surrendered men stayed against the canyon wall for a long time after the shooting stopped. Elias came back down from the ridge and stood in the middle of the canyon floor and looked at what the morning had made of Raven's Pass. The dust was still settling, drifting in the cold air in slow curtains, catching the thin winter light that reached the canyon floor only at its highest angle. The entrance was solid stone. 3 of Harrow's men were down and unmoving. 2 were alive and had made the correct calculation about their odds. He looked at the 2 standing men. "You're going to walk out of this canyon," he said. "There's a path on the west side that wasn't blocked. It comes out above the tree line half a mile north. From there you go south and you don't stop." The men looked at each other. "The alternative," Elias said, "is that I think about what your employer did to my family and make a different decision." They chose the path. He watched them go, then turned and looked up at the eastern ridge where Isabella was visible against the pale winter sky, standing now, her rifle at her side, looking down at the canyon floor with the expression of someone who has just done something they were not sure they were capable of and has not yet had time to decide how they feel about it. He knew that expression. He had worn it himself years ago in a different kind of hard country. He raised one hand. After a moment, she raised hers in return. He began the work of the canyon, methodical, necessary, done with the same thoroughness he brought to anything the ranch required. By the time Isabella came down from the ridge, he was sitting on a flat boulder near the north end of the pass, with his rifle across his knees and his face turned toward the thin slot of sky above. The winter blue of it was very clean. She sat down beside him. They were quiet for a while, the specific quiet that comes after something large has happened. Not peaceful, not tense, but very real, the way things feel when the surface that ordinary life puts over events has been stripped away and you are sitting directly on the thing itself. "Are you hurt?" he said again. "No," she said. This time the word had more room in it. She looked at her hands in her lap, the hands that had held the rifle, that had learned the trigger weight in the October weeks when she had asked him to teach her to shoot better, and he had done it without asking why she needed to know. "He mentioned Greta?" she said. Before the end, Elias turned to look at her. "She was the servant who helped me escape England." Her voice was steady. She had made it steady with effort. "He said she was dealt with before my ship left port." She paused. "I had hoped for 11 months that she had gotten away." The canyon was very quiet around them. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded. There was a particular grief in the words "dealt with" that she was going to have to carry for a long time, and she knew it. There would be a day to give that grief its proper weight. But not today. She knew what she was risking. Isabella said, "She had worked for my father for 30 years. She knew exactly what choosing to help me meant." She paused. "I think she would consider it worth it. That is not consolation exactly, but it is something." Elias said nothing. He understood that some things did not need responses. He had learned this in 9 years of living with things that had no adequate responses, and had come to understand that the absence of response in the right company was not emptiness, but presence. They sat together in the winter canyon until the cold had settled into the rock beneath them. Then they got up and rode back toward Boone Ridge. The quiet lasted through the ride back and into the following day, which was the first quiet that felt like choice rather than exhaustion. Isabella sat at the table in the main cabin that evening and wrote 3 letters. The first was to the federal judge in Helena, whose name Kane had confirmed, a careful, precise letter laying out the legal basis for the claims in the document with specific reference to the relevant statutes and the names of the federal properties affected. The second was a summary of what Kane had witnessed and what he was prepared to testify to, written in the format of a formal deposition. The third was to a lawyer in Philadelphia, whose name her father had given her years ago as someone who operated entirely outside the kind of network Harrow had built, a just-in-case name pressed into her memory the way her father pressed useful things into her memory when she was a child, not knowing she would need them, but knowing the world was the kind of place where you might. She wrote until the lamp burned low. Elias came in from the barn and found her at the table and put more wood on the fire without asking what she was writing. In the morning, she would take the letters to Dry Creek and send them with the first available post. But that was the morning. That night, she finished the third letter, folded all 3 carefully, and set them in a row on the table. Then she sat back and looked at them and felt something she had not felt since before the morning in Yorkshire that had ended everything. Not safety exactly. Safety was a word she had stopped trusting because it tended to be temporary. More like the feeling of having done the thing that needed to be done with the right tools in the right place, with the right person beside you. She looked at the 3 crosses on the ridge through the window, visible in the moonlight, pale shapes against the dark. She thought about names. 3 weeks later, Aldous Kane sat in a small anteroom in the federal building in Helena and gave his testimony to a court reporter who wrote everything down in shorthand without reacting to any of it. Kane had arrived in Helena 4 days after the events at Raven's Pass. He had traveled with a bruise along his left jaw from an encounter with one of Harrow's remaining men in Dry Creek, who had figured out quickly enough what Kane had done. The bruise was already fading by the time he reached Helena, but he kept it covered as long as it was visible because it made people ask questions, and he was not ready to answer them yet. The testimony took most of a morning. He told it completely, which was harder than he had expected and less hard than he had feared. At the end of it, the court reporter gathered his papers and left without comment. The lawyer who had arranged the session, a compact man in his 40s who had met Kane and Isabella at the door with the exact level of wariness appropriate to two strangers arriving with a serious allegation, looked at Kane for a long moment. "This will take time," he said. "Courts don't move quickly." "I know," Kane said. "You understand your own exposure in this matter?" "Yes." The lawyer nodded. He looked at the document that Isabella had placed on his desk at the beginning of the meeting. The original finally unsealed from its stitched compartment in the suitcase lining, set down on a surface in a place where it was meant to be read by people with the authority to act on it. "We'll begin the review," the lawyer said. He paused. "What you've done here, both of you, this is not a small thing." Neither of them said anything. Small and large were complicated categories. They went out into the winter street in Helena and walked in the same direction for a block and then went different ways. Spring came to the Bitterroot Valley, the way it always came, slowly with setbacks, and then all at once. The snow retreated in the order it always retreated from the south-facing slopes. First, then the valley floor, then the lower mountain flanks, and finally, from the high places where it had been the deepest and the longest. The creek beside the small cabin ran fast with snowmelt for 3 weeks, louder than Isabella had ever heard it, filling the air with a constant, low, rushing sound that was, she thought, the sound of a season completing itself. Dry Creek was different now, in the specific way that places are different when a pressure that has been exerted on them for a period is suddenly removed. The difference was not dramatic. It was the difference between holding your breath and breathing, between a posture held against something and a posture simply held. The sheriff wore his own watch again. The new one had disappeared shortly after word of Harrow's death reached town, returned to whoever had given it to him or quietly discarded. The landowners who had attended Harrow's evening meeting at the saloon did not discuss it, which was itself a kind of statement. Samuel Carter, who had dismissed Eleanor Marsh with genuine reluctance on the worst day of her time in Dry Creek, came up to Boone Ridge one April morning on his old brown horse with a parcel of supplies he said needed delivering, and stayed for coffee, and said at the end of the coffee that he hoped she knew his door was open if she needed anything in town. He did not apologize directly. He was not a man who found direct apologies natural, but he stayed for this coffee and said the thing about the door, and Isabella looked at him across the table with the expression she reserved for things that were imperfect but were the best available version of themselves. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said. He nodded. He went back down the mountain. Daniel came to Dry Creek in the 3rd week of April. He was small, for 9 or possibly 8. He was not entirely sure of his own age, and he had been sleeping in various locations in and around the stable for 6 weeks before Samuel Carter noticed him consistently enough to start leaving food near the back door of the mercantile. He worked for anyone who offered work. He was careful and quiet and did not ask for things unless he already knew the answer was likely yes. Isabella saw him on the morning she came down for salt and candle stock. He was crouched in the alley beside the blacksmith's shop, picking up pieces of coal that had fallen from the delivery bin, moving each piece to a small bucket with the deliberate efficiency of someone who has learned that thoroughness matters more than speed. She stopped. The alley was cold and the bucket was barely a quarter full, and the boy did not look up, just kept working at his task with the concentration of someone accustomed to completing things alone. She stepped into the alley. He looked up then. His face was guarded in the specific way she recognized, not hostile, just careful. The expression of someone who has learned that strangers usually want something from you and rarely give you anything in return. She held out a coin. He looked at it. "I didn't do anything for you yet," he said. "Do you want to carry my supplies to the horse?" she said. He considered this seriously. "How far is the horse outside Carter's store?" "2 buildings down." He considered the distance and the coin. "Yes," he said. He picked up the bucket of coal and set it somewhere safe, a gesture so automatic that she knew it was a long-established habit, the careful preservation of small things that might otherwise be lost, and came with her to the store. While she was inside, he waited with the horse without being asked to. When she came out, he loaded the saddlebags with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he had done this before for other people many times. She looked at him. "What's your name?" she said. "Daniel." "Where are you sleeping, Daniel?" He hesitated, the hesitation of someone weighing how much information was safe to give. "The stable lets me use the corner by the feed room," he said finally. She looked at his face. She looked at the patched jacket and the boots that had been mended and remended to the point where it was hard to say what material they had originally been. She thought about a woman standing on a coach step, calculating how much of herself to show a place she had not yet decided was safe. She paid him. Then she said, "There's a ranch up in the mountains, above Dry Creek. It belongs to a man named Elias Boone." Daniel waited. "The ranch needs someone who is willing to work," she said. "Someone who can learn things. The winters are hard. The work is real." "What kind of work?" he said. "Fences? Animals? Accounts if you can learn to read properly, whatever the ranch needs." He looked at her with the assessing look of someone who does not trust easily but is listening very carefully. "Why would they want me?" he said. The question was not self-pitying. It was practical, the way his question about the horse's distance had been practical. He was auditing the offer. "Because they need hands and you need a place," she said, "and because sometimes that is exactly enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Would I have to leave when winter comes?" he said. She thought about the question. She thought about all the places she had been where the answer to that question had been yes or some version of yes, and about the morning she had arrived at Boone Ridge and what Elias had said about the small cabin near the creek. "No," she said. Daniel looked at the mountains above the town, the long slope of the Bitterroot rising above the valley, the pines pressing dark and close above the tree line, and above the pines, the pale grey stone of the high ridges against the April sky. "All right," he said. He came to Boone Ridge 4 days later on a Saturday morning with a small bundle of belongings tied into a flour sack and the same bucket of coal that he had apparently completed filling and brought along on the principle that useful things should not be abandoned. Isabella was at the window when she heard the horse and looked out and saw Elias coming up the trail with the boy beside him on a borrowed horse from the Dry Creek stable. She watched them come through the gate and dismount. Daniel looked at the ranch with the slow, systematic attention of someone new to a place, the cabin, the barn, the fence lines, the mountains pressing close on 3 sides. She watched him do it. She recognized the quality of that, looking the way his eyes moved from one element to the next without hurrying, not sightseeing, but mapping. The look of a person who has learned to assess new places quickly, because new places are where you end up when old ones stop working and you cannot afford to misread the new one. She had looked at Boone Ridge the same way on the morning she arrived. She went outside. "Welcome to Boone Ridge," she said. He looked at her, then at the mountains again, then back at her. There was something shifting in his expression, not quite belief yet, but the beginning of the consideration of belief. The look of a child who has been told something good is possible and is waiting for the specific reason it will turn out not to be. She stood still and let him look. "Is that your cabin?" he said, pointing to the small structure near the creek. "It is," she said, "so I'd have a different one." "The barn has a room at the back," Elias said. "Warm, dry, room for your things." Daniel looked at the barn. He looked at the bucket of coal in his hand, then at the wood stack near the main cabin, and with the logic of a child who had been finding places for himself for long enough that the logic had become automatic, he set the coal bucket down next to the wood stack where it looked like it had always belonged. Isabella watched this, the small, careful gesture of a boy placing one useful thing beside another useful thing in a place that was going to need both, as if he were already tending it, as if he had already in some small way begun. "All right," he said, which was apparently his expression of agreement on matters of significance. He picked up his flour sack and looked at Elias. "What do we do first?" he said. Elias glanced at Isabella. Something passed between them, brief, steady, the communication of 2 people who had been through enough together that their shorthand had weight. "The north fence needs checking," Elias said. "Come on." They walked off toward the pasture together. The tall, quiet man and the small, careful boy and Isabella stood near the cabin and watched them go and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. The spring deepened into something that felt for the first time in a long time like it was going to last. Daniel learned the fence work and the animal work and the early versions of the account work with the concentrated speed of a child who has understood from experience that knowledge is one of the things that cannot be taken from you and is therefore worth accumulating. He learned to read better in the evenings by the cabin lamp, with Isabella across the table and a book open between them, and what he lacked in formal education, he made up in the specific intelligence of a person who had been required to be observant since a very young age. Elias taught him the mountains the same way he had taught Isabella, by showing, not explaining, and then waiting to see what the showing produced. He taught him the sky and the wind and the snow signs and the water signs, and the way the light changed on the high slopes when the temperature was about to change. He taught him how to read a trapline and how to read an animal's tracks, and how to know by a dozen small signs what had passed through a particular piece of ground and when. Daniel absorbed all of it with the serious attention of someone taking careful notes. He did not speak much about his past. Elias did not ask about it. Isabella understood this the way she understood most things about Boone Ridge, not because it had been explained, but because it was simply how the place worked, and the place had its own wisdom about these things. On a morning in late May, when the last of the high snow was finally retreating from the northern ridges and the pasture had gone from brown to the particular green that was the color of things starting over, Isabella walked up the slope behind the main cabin to the place where the 3 crosses stood. She stood in front of them for a moment. The wood was old and gray, and the names were worn to first letters. But she had learned to read the first letters the way you learn to read anything when you look long enough. C-R-M, Catherine. Ruth, May. She had thought about this morning for a while, not planned it exactly, more allowed it to happen when it was ready to happen. She stood in the spring light and looked at the crosses and thought about a woman she had never known and 2 children she had never known, and the specific shape of a grief that a man had carried alone for 9 years and called something other than grief because grief needed witnesses to be named. She heard Elias behind her on the slope. He came up and stood beside her and said nothing. They stood together in the morning light, with the valley spread below them and the mountains rising behind, and the only sound was the wind through the new grass and the distant sound of Daniel's voice from the pasture talking to one of the horses in the particular one-sided way that children talk to animals they are becoming fond of. After a long while, Isabella asked the question she had been holding since October, since the night she had told him her name, and he had said the names he had read in the ledger, and she had seen the recognition in his face and understood for the first time that his silence was not a wall but a room she had been slowly invited into. "What were their names?" she said, quietly, not as a prompt, as a question asked of someone ready to answer it. Elias was still for a moment. Then he said, "Catherine," a pause. "Ruth," another pause. "May." He said them the way you say the names of things that are gone carefully, as if the saying were a kind of keeping. The wind moved through the grass around the crosses and carried the names out over the slope and down toward the valley. The way wind in the bitterroot carried everything it encountered without judgment, without sentiment, without keeping any of it for itself. Neither of them spoke again for a while. Below, Daniel's voice rose in a sudden laugh at something the horse had done and then subsided back into the ordinary sounds of the morning, the creak of the fence gate, the stamp of the horse's foot, the distant first sound of the day's work beginning. Isabella stood beside Elias in the spring light and felt for the first time in 11 months that she had stopped moving. Not because she had arrived at safety, she was still deciding whether that word meant what she had always thought it meant, but because she had arrived at something that did not require the next step yet. She had arrived at a place where she could stand still. After another long moment, she said very quietly, "I'd like to change my name." Elias looked at her. "Not back to Whitmore," she said. That is a name that belongs to a life I can't live anymore. And Eleanor Marsh was the name I wore to survive." She was looking at the crosses. "I would like a name that is chosen, rather than inherited or invented." He was quiet. "My mother's name was Anne," she said. "She died when I was 11. I don't think I've said her name aloud in a very long time." She stopped. Elias said, "It's a good name." She nodded once. They stood together on the hillside above Boone Ridge, in the spring morning in the valley that the Bitterroot Mountains had carved and kept and given back in the place where things were grown rather than taken until the day was fully established and the work of it was waiting. Then they turned and walked back down. The federal proceedings moved with the specific deliberateness of legal processes that are significant enough to be handled carefully. The judge in Helena took the document and Kane's testimony into consideration over the winter and into the spring, and the review that followed reached back across 2 continents and 15 years of carefully arranged transactions, and found beneath the arrangement what a document written in a man's own hand and witnessed by his own chosen associate had always contained. The truth, in the end, did not need to be clever. It only needed to be delivered to someone with the authority and the independence to act on it. Some things were not recoverable. The land in England that had been the Whitmore estate was now in other hands through a chain of transactions sufficiently complicated that untangling it would take years. Her father and brother could not be recovered by any legal proceeding. Greta could not be recovered. Other things were. The mining rights that had been the original object of Harrow's interest were voided. The assets of Harrow's North American operations, which were considerable, were frozen pending further investigation. Several of the properties on the list, including a ranch in the Bitterroot Valley, Montana, bearing the name of a man who had believed for 9 years that his loss was accident and weather, were formally cleared of the fraudulent claims that had been filed against them. It was not justice in the complete sense. Isabella had stopped believing in the complete sense some time ago, but it was the specific kind of partial justice that has weight, that means something to the people for whom it is made, even when it cannot give back what was taken. She read the letter from the Helena lawyer at the table in the main cabin in Boone Ridge on a July morning when the light through the window was the long, gold particular light of high summer in the mountains, and the creek beside the small cabin was running clear and fast and singing over its pale stones, and somewhere across the pasture, Daniel was checking the north fence line on the horse he had learned to ride in April and would be back for breakfast in 20 minutes. She folded the letter and set it on the table. Elias was watching her from the doorway. She looked at him. "It's over," she said. He came inside. He sat across from her at the table, the same table where she had told him everything on a winter night with the coals burning low and the wind against the walls, and he looked at the folded letter and then at her face. And he nodded once, slowly, in the particular way of a man receiving information that requires a moment to reach all the places it needs to reach. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Outside, the July morning was moving through Boone Ridge with the unhurried authority of something that had decided to stay the light on the pasture, the sound of the creek, the distant stamp of a horse, the smell of pine and new grass, and the particular clean cold of mountain air in summer. It was ordinary, all of it entirely, completely ordinary. Isabella Boone. She had chosen the name a month ago, sitting at the table in the small cabin near the creek, with the spring light coming in through the east window, and Elias had said nothing except that it was a good name, which was his way of saying yes to most things and everything. To some of them sat at the table in the main cabin of Boone Ridge and let the ordinary morning be exactly what it was. No calculation, no next step, no assessment of how much of herself was safe to show. Just the morning and the table and the man across from her who had learned 9 years ago that the mountains kept nothing except what was true and had built his whole life on that principle and had been right. The door to the yard was open. The summer light lay across the floor in a long bright stripe. After a while Daniel came through it, his boots loud on the boards, his face flushed from the ride, already asking about breakfast before he had closed the door behind him. Everything continued.